So what exactly are the options? Well, I think there are 4 of them that I would like to consider just briefly. The first of these, as we already saw, is the divine command theory. This is the view that says that there is a God, there is a moral law, and God alone through His will is the only possible basis for the moral law. In other words, God creates values. He fiats them. The second one is what we might call natural law theory. This is the view that says that there is a God, there is a moral law, and God is, in fact, the basis for morality, but not through His unknowable will, but through His knowable nature. And we can know the effect, that is the moral law, without necessarily knowing the cause, which is God. Just as we can know God's effects in physical nature by science without knowing their divine creative cause. In other words, natural law theory says that God's nature is the basis for morality. The third alternative is called Existential Atheism. And this comes by way of Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French atheist. He basically said that there is no God, there is no real moral law, only arbitrary man-made rules of the man-made moral game. Ivan Karamazov, in the famous novel written by Dostoevsky, put it this way: if God does not exist, everything is permissible. In other words, there can be no a priori good or pre-existing good. Human beings just make up right and wrong and then impose them upon one another. The fourth view is called Humanism, and it comes in 2 forms. There is the atheistic version of humanism, probably best exhibited in the writings of Kai Nielsen. And then there is a sort of theistic version of this that comes by way of philosopher Immanuel Kant. This view says that morality is self-justifying because human beings are ends in themselves, that is to say, they are intrinsically valuable. So what do we do with these views? How can we work through them? Well, I think we can immediately dismiss at least 2 of these. The first of these, of course, is what we've already talked about, and that is the divine command theory. This makes morality arbitrary. It makes it based on the idea that might makes right. And so the term good means that God can impose His moral will on people. I think we should recognize this as unacceptable. Another one I think we can dismiss is existential atheism, because this view says that there is no God, there is no real moral law, only arbitrary man-made rules. Now, while I think this is the most honest of the atheistic options, and certainly if I were an atheist, I think I would opt for this one, because this seems to be the most consistent with atheism. But I think deep down inside, we do know that there are really objective moral values. There are really things that are wrong and things that are really right. So number 4 of the ones that we listed is humanism. And although this one is not quite as easy to dismiss, I'm going to mention a couple of problems that I have with it. The first problem with the view is that it says morality is self-justifying because human persons are ends in themselves. And I think this is a problem because this basically tries to ground morality in a view of truth known as coherentism. In other words, the humanistic approaches of Kai Nielsen and Immanuel Kant say that as long as you have a consistent moral theory, then that is sufficient to justify morality. But the problem with that is by following a coherentist view of truth, it just doesn't seem to be grounded anywhere, because you can have a multiple number of coherent systems of morality, and they can even conflict with one another, and all of them be coherent and thus justifiable based upon this particular theory of truth. But I think that this is a problem, because how would you know which one of these consistent moral theories is the best one without some means of grounding it? It seems that you cannot. Every single coherent system would be just as valid as the next, even though they may conflict with one another. So I think that the humanistic idea is a problem as well. I think that the best option is the natural law approach. It's the only one that can maintain an objective morality while avoiding the dilemma of Euthyphro. So, how do we avoid the two horns of the dilemma? Well, I think there is a third option, a sort of tertium quid. And the third option says this, that there is an objective moral standard that exists, and this, of course, will help us to avoid the first horn of the dilemma because morality is not arbitrary. However, the standard for morality is not external to God, but is internal to God. And by placing the standard of morality internal to God, we are able to avoid the second horn of the dilemma because God does not have to look at something external to himself. In other words, morality is grounded in the immutable character of God, who is perfectly good. Now, what this means is that his commands are not whims, but rather they are rooted in his holiness. So could God have simply decreed that torturing babies is moral? No, he could not do that. He could never do that. Why? Because it is not a matter of command, it is a matter of character. So as a Christian, we can avoid that dilemma entirely by pointing out that morality is not exterior to God, or say it's not logically prior to him, as Bertrand Russell suggests, but rather it is rooted in God's nature. So we can be confident that whatever a good God commands will always be good, and his will and his commands are not arbitrary at all. But this raises another question. How do we know what is good? How can we come to understand goodness? We asked the question earlier, does one have to believe in God to know what is good? The answer seems to be no. Well then, how is it when we ground morality in God that a person can still come to know what is good? In other words, do we have to know the definition of goodness before we can know what goodness is? And I think the answer to that is found in the story in the Old Testament of Abraham when he first learned of God's intention to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember that story? In Genesis chapter 18, Abraham, in talking with God, says this, in verse 25, "Far be it from thee to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly?" Now remember, God is going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of the unrighteousness that exists there. And Abraham is contending with God over this. It is a matter of justice. Surely the judge of all the earth will not judge the righteous with the unrighteous, Abraham says. So here's the question. How did Abraham know what justice meant, or that justice required that God not treat the wicked and the righteous the same way? This is particularly interesting given the fact that this is before the giving of the law, the giving of the Torah. No commandments had been handed down yet. Well, it seems that Abraham knew goodness, not through some prior definition, nor by a decree given of God, but rather through moral intuition. In other words, he didn't need God to define justice for him through a series of divine commands, but rather he knew it directly. In other words, it seems as if he had moral knowledge that was in some way intuitive, built in. So even an atheist who doesn't believe in God understands what morality is. An atheist doesn't need God in order to recognize morality, although the atheist does need God to make sense of what he recognizes. In fact, this is why I think the moral argument for God's existence is such a good one, because the very awareness of morality leads to God, much as the awareness of falling apples leads us to conclude that there is such a thing as gravity. So, our moral intuitions recognize the effect. But what is the cause? If God does not exist, then morality seems to be an incoherent notion, and our intuitions are just sheer nonsense. It has been said that God has chosen to reveal himself to human beings through three means: through creation, through conscience, and through Christ. And it is the second of these three things, through conscience, that we are discussing here. That is what I mean by moral intuition. And in the second chapter of the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul seems to be suggesting this very thing when he talks about how the Gentiles are able to, nonetheless, discern right and wrong and are equally guilty before God for violating the moral law, even though they don't have the law proper, that is, the Mosaic law that the Jews had. And so, just as one can recognize an effect without knowing its cause, a person who doesn't believe in God can, nonetheless, recognize that there are objective moral values, that there is a moral law, without acknowledging that there is a God. So, is something good because God wills it? Or does God will it because it is good? I think we've seen that the answer to that question is neither. God wills what is good because he is a good God. His nature is a standard for morality. Also, if God does not exist, is everything permissible? I think that the answer to that question is yes. Why? Because the existence of morality depends upon God's existence. Every effect needs a cause. But can one be good without believing in God? I think the answer is yes. And so, exactly how do we move from here and establish this more firmly, that morality depends on God? Perhaps the best way to illustrate how we can move from an objective moral law to God is by looking briefly at the argument from the moral law. This is the argument that was championed by C.S. Lewis. The argument works like this. There are two premises and a conclusion. Premise 1, an objective moral law implies a moral lawgiver. Premise 2, an objective moral law exists. Conclusion, therefore, a moral lawgiver exists. Now, when we consider premise 1, an objective moral law implies a moral lawgiver, we need to qualify that a little bit. Why is it that an objective moral law implies a moral lawgiver? Well, we've already hinted. The answer is that if we acknowledge that there is an objective moral law, then this objective moral law is only as valid as its basis, or it is only as valid as the authority behind it. Why should I feel any sense of obligation or duty if morality is nothing more than a social convention? Why should I feel obligated to obey a set of rules derived through blind, unguided, arbitrary processes of biological evolution? So it seems that if there is a real objective moral law, then that implies a moral lawgiver. Perhaps it would be good to provide a better definition of what I mean by objective moral law. By objective, I mean that it stands on its own. It does not depend on human beings. If it depended on human beings for its existence, it would be subjective. That is to say, it would depend on humans for its grounding, which we have seen is problematic. To say it is objective, we mean that it is something that stands above us, that we either recognize or do not. A way to illustrate this is to say that if Nazi Germany had won World War II and imposed their laws upon the whole world, and everybody was forced to accept this Nazi morality, Nazi Germany's values and principles would still be wrong. They would still be objectively wrong. So by objective, we mean that it stands on its own, that even if human beings fail to acknowledge it, it still stands. Now, the second premise concerns an objective moral law and its existence. Does an objective moral law exist? Do we have any reason to think that it does? And I think that we do have good reasons. It seems that when one takes the time to study cultures carefully, it is recognizable that there is such a thing as good and bad behavior in all cultures. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, he provides an appendix in the back of the book in which he documents all the major civilizations in history. And it is interesting to note that there is a common core of morality that exists in all those cultures. In other words, they all have laws against certain things like murder, rape, theft, and lying. They all say that those things are wrong, and they all recognize that some things are really good, that self-sacrifice, that kindness and love are really good things, and that these are things that should be pursued. And so it seems that there is evidence that there is an objective moral law, and that all people have the capacity to recognize it. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody follows it. In fact, Lewis argues in Mere Christianity that if there are two things that are most clear with respect to human beings, it is that they all recognize that there is a standard of good and bad behavior, and secondly, that they fail to uphold it consistently. So I think we have good reasons to believe that there is an objective moral law. And if the first premise is accepted and an objective moral law exists, then an objective moral lawgiver must exist necessarily.